Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Rachel, and I'm the Events and Social Manager here at Identity Automation. Today, our presenter is Identity Automation's very own Senior Sales Strategist, Tim Till. Today's webinar, the Overcome the Challenges of Data Rostering to Digital Learning Resources with Rapid Identity Rostering webinar, will cover how Rapid Identity Rostering provides schools with flexibility, granular control, and scalability. So now it's time for the webinar. I'm going to be passing the mic and controls over to Tim for him to give a brief overview of his time at Identity Automation, and then he'll dive into the webinar.
Thank you, Rachel. So appreciate everybody taking the time out today. Don't want to spend too much time about myself, but I'll just say that I have been with Identity Automation for a fair amount of time, and I've worked directly with most of our education clients. So assuredly, hopefully most of the people on the call today are in the education world. And if not, then just ask some questions at the end, and I can show you how these topics resonate in other verticals as well. But the topics we're going to be presenting today really deal with pain points that we've seen for years in education. We'll do a little bit of a history lesson, and then we'll show you how we're addressing that for our customers today. So let's talk a little bit about rostering. It's not a new topic for anybody by any stretch of the imagination. But I do want to quickly give you the history of how we arrived at our approach today. So back in the late 2000s, maybe early 2010s, we were doing rostering for schools. Primarily that was reflected in their local storage, right? So in a school, you have 40,000 classes going on during a semester. Or throughout the course years. And what we'll typically did at the time was grab all that course data, and it was pretty raw, so we had to make it a unique course attribute, and we would concatenate together different values like term and period, and course code and section numbers to create a unique course ID. And that became an attribute that we would then associate the teacher and the student together. And the end result of the school district was we would build out all their local storage, we would build out course shares and apply assignments folders and turn-in folders and graded folders. And that was the initial kind of permutation of rostering back in the day. But then that evolved over time to start incorporating that same level of data granularity to normally textbook providers were really where the initial pain points were manifested. But since then, the inventory and library of different applications and services that schools are leveraging to deliver their education technology and curriculum is growing every year. It's an unceasing inventory and library of potential integration points. And not everyone plays by the same rules. So when customers have come to us to help meet that challenge, the biggest gap that we had was closing the technical gap for our customers, right? Because our tool to do identity management is extremely powerful and flexible and can absolutely do those integrations. But traditionally, it's a different group within the school that's trying to integrate these applications. It's typically not your infrastructure group. Typically, it's your C&I group, and so you can't expect them to be people that can do deep system integrations. That's not their role. So what we've endeavored to build out here, what we're going to be demonstrating and showing you is our approach to close that gap, right? How can we give you that same level of integration flexibility without having a massive, leap in needs to train and get up to speed on the tool to do those kinds of things. So we'll start by talking about what our roster solution supports today. And that's going to be web service level integrations and flat file level integrations. So at a high level, when it comes to web services, there are two broad APIs that we'll support. The first is going to be one roster, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. But we also have what we call EdSync, which basically is the open documentation of the Clever API. So if a service or solution is supportive of those methods, then we'll be able to integrate those solutions in a fairly plug-and-play way. The other, which is probably the vast majority of your integrations, would be through flat files. And there's really just a few options there. The first is going to obviously be one roster, which is an attempt at data standardization of the file structure and data points. But the reality is that that's not going to hit all your vendors. In fact, it's going to hit a very small footprint of those vendors. And so the file integration that we have is abstracted enough that whatever file structure or number of files that the vendor requires, the solution will be able to accommodate. So the goal here is to give you flexibility in how you provide that data between different systems. The other important thing to understand when it comes to our approach to rostering is these three buckets of how the data flows. So speaking first to delineating between a provider and a consumer. A provider is a system of record that holds data that other systems want to have, right? And the consumers are those applications that their whole function in the play is to consume that data. Now, a solution could be both, right? A student information system is obviously a provider of course data, student data, demographic data, but it's also a consumer of other data points, such as grades and other information that may come from some of these other applications and services. The second will be data staging. Now, this is important. So in the flow that we're providing, we'll show you this too in the demonstration, we are able to help you validate and clean the data by staging it multiple times. So there's a staging of that data prior to it moving on in the process to the MetaVault, and then prior from it moving from the MetaVault to a downstream system. So you can stage that data as you're pulling it from a provider, and then stage that data before you provide it to a consumer. The third is the MetaVault. So the MetaVault would be the repository of all of your staged data that has been pulled from all of your providers. It is the area that your consumers will be pulling data from, or files will be generated from for those consumer systems. So the MetaVault is sort of the database that resides in the middle of all these services for you. You have visibility into the data points provided in the MetaVault, and the MetaVault is what controls the structure of that data for you. The other component of the new solution that we're providing our customers is the application catalog within Studio. So it's starting out today with, depending upon how you count the applications, because you could say, well, it's got a one roster integration point. That means it supports hundreds of applications. But those of you who are on the call who do these things on a daily basis recognize that just because a system says it supports one roster does not necessarily mean you're going to have an effective integration with that system sticking strictly to one roster standards. So agnostic to one roster, there are probably about 60 different applications in the catalog today, and the goal is for that to continue to grow. So as you look at what we're doing, so this is, what we're going to show you today is a sort of a phase one. This is the initial release of the product. What's going to be coming next and what's on the roadmap for this solution is providing you deeper reporting and granular analytics. Our customers have told us they would like to see a report of which data points are shared with which vendors, and then you want to be able to report internally on which data points are considered sensitive and who has access to it. And that plays perfectly in with what we provide our customers, which is a security framework for managing an identity and access governance program. The second piece would be, in that development path, is to continually build out that library of integrated applications. Part of that will be, when we say community, the goal there is, as customers begin adopting different applications and configuring within the portal, that they can export that, we can test and validate it, and then we can make it available for other customers and really build out a user group community as well. So that's a big focus of where we're taking this. So now what we're going to do is a quick solution walkthrough. So just give me one moment while I switch my screens. All right. Studio will be a component in your RapidIdentity portfolio. Now, some quick questions here. If you're an existing customer and we already own our automated lifecycle management and our single sign-on solutions, Studio is not a for-pay item. It is a value add that we're providing to customers in the education space to give you additional functionality. So it's taken a lot of blood, sweat, and tears to get here, but the goal here is to provide this for customers quickly and let them start getting value out of it very quickly as well. So this is a look at a demonstration environment of Studio. So there's some demonstration data points in here and services. What you're seeing here are the applications that are currently loaded into the demonstration environment. And to add an application, it would take you to that community library that I was telling you about. So these are the applications that we currently have open for customers to bring in. So let's say you want to install a new application. So once that's gone through the installation process, it should be brought into your library. So here we have the HMH solution here. And then you can configure that integration point. So this is showing you that it's going to be pulling data from the meta, it will be staging it, and then providing it to HMH. As you can see, a lot of those record definitions already pre-built for you using what the vendor has prescribed. So here you have your different files that are being generated, and then you have your record mappings in those files as well. So in this, you're able to review the data, the field mappings that are going to be moving through that integration point. But then you can also control and filter that data. So if you wanted to, say, filter on grade level is equal to 5, right? Then that means that it's going to filter that data in the push to only make it so that records that have a grade level equal to 5 is being provided. But then you can continue to nest that logic as deep as you need to go to create a complex data filtering rule so that you can have more granular point-by-point control over what data points are provided in those files to those vendors. So additionally, this will be a delimited text file, right? And then you're just providing the protocol on the host, right? So are you going SFTP or S3 buckets, or is this an SMB share? So in the configuration of this integration, you're just determining the path that you're putting it, all the standard things that you would do to automate the file output and placement. But again, the goal here is to provide this to customers without having to have them go through, training in our background engine of Connect, right? You also have the ability to, explore the data. So this will show you all the different consumers that you're providing, what's in the metaverse. You can search that filter, or you can add different things to filter against in that data and take a look at everything that you're providing in the metaverse. And then all these integration points can be scheduled in a job. So you can schedule these to run as frequently as is required by your business rules, or they can be run once per day, every few minutes, or whatever that integration level needs to be. You have control over that as well. Hopefully what you're seeing here is that the goal is to provide our customers flexibility and scalability in terms of managing their curriculum delivery applications without having to have a deep technical background to do that. So at this point, let's go ahead and take a look at some of the questions that we have popping up. So first of all, one of the questions here, do the educational apps pay a licensing fee? So the business model around our solution, we do not charge the vendors anything. We provide, if the vendor wants an instance of Studio to do their own testing, we provide that at no cost, and we encourage it. We have some of our customers who are very good about pointing vendors to us to help build out an integration if that's necessary. Indian Prairie is a great customer. They come to mind. They're very forward thinking on things like that. And, we've struggled in the past on providing an easy mechanism for these vendors. Right, this makes it very easy for them to run API through development. It doesn't have to be you or us doing these integrations. The vendors are able to do them too, and there's no cost. We also do not charge our education customers if they already own our product. Now, obviously, you're all existing customers, so no one's going to be paying for this. But let's say a new customer comes on board, all they want is Studio. Yeah, there would be a licensing fee for that. But today, it's marketed to be at no cost to our K-12 customers who already own our identity management solution. Another question we have here is, do we have the ability to change the data mapping from the SAS to the meta storage? Absolutely. So just like when you're doing a consumer pool and you're configuring that, you can determine all your filtering rules in that pool as well. So even though I may be pulling out raw data, I can filter the source data as well before it goes into the metaverse with whatever conditional rules that I want to put on it. The third question here is there an API consumers can use versus receiving FTP files? Yes. So when you're configuring your integration point, we can do API or we can do file. And if you're doing it through, like for example, here you'll see that this is using their published API for the ARIES Student Information System, which is a prevalent system in California, just as an example. So we can do API using OneRoster or EdSync is the API that the two API models we support. OneRoster obviously is the industry standardized from IMS Global, and then EdSync is basically the open documentation on the Clever API. It mimics and mirrors that exactly. So if it supports a Clever API pull, they would be able to pull it from here as well, just changing out the API key. Flat file queries. I'm going to have to get back to that one here because I'm not sure on the question. So we currently have to create our own SQL to create CSV files and FTP to vendor. Okay, so I think that's a clarification or more context on the first question. So whenever we're providing a file integration point, you can do that. Let me bring up an example here. So you can do these from scratch, meaning like if there's no template for it, you can add record definitions here. You can name those definitions. You can add your columns, your date formats, and then you can, determine which records you want to bring into the filter for that file. So you would have to, if you're doing this from scratch for something that there's no template for, it's gonna be a little bit time intensive the first time. You're probably looking at a few hours to take a look at the documentation on what that file requires. But in terms of doing a SQL query to create the CSV files, the goal here is if I'm pulling that data from your SIS and other providers, and I'm bringing that into the metadata, then the metadata is that database that holds it all. So I am querying the metaverse instead to get that data. So that's all your record mappings. So anytime I'm building a record definition here, I'm determining which data points by the header that I'm going to be pulling in, and then you're controlling the filtering of that data here as well. So in terms of getting the data into the Meta Vault, it really is going to depend on your SIS. The best way is through I would say the OneRoster API, if it has that. So an example of that would be your Infinite Campus, ARIES, right? I think PowerSchool is coming out with one if they don't have one as well. Those API pulls or providers are going to be better than just straight up flat files. So ARIES here, you can see it's using a web service client. And so here's the API pull that we're bringing in for that one. So API is going to be cleaner, primarily because you're not having to build out those queries we were talking about. Synergy EduPoint, I believe, does not have an API, so that would have to be flat file. But I believe PowerSchool does have an API. Another question here is, do you have the ability to emulate the logon of a student and test their experience with an app that's been rostered? So in our new UI, let me go here to this one here, we do have this ability to proxy as. And so if you're on the latest and greatest, you can pick a student that you have view over, and you can experience the SSO. So you would see if the application was rostered and if it was put into their application library. Now, proxying as, to be clear, is not impersonation. So I can't, if I'm the student, I can't launch Gmail as that student, right? I can just see from policy what his view is and the experience is as if I were that user. I could see his files, and I could see, his views, and I could see, if you're using requests, what he has the entitlements for, and what he can request access to. Obviously, in most examples, you're not going to give students the ability to request things, but this is just showing that in proxying mode, I can view if he has that application, right? So a teacher can proxy as one of their students and see their view. But you cannot impersonate, so I'm not going to be able to experience that application as that student. Let's see, another question here. Will there be a way to add additional information which is not pulled by the OneRoster API, say a static field which is required by the end vendor? Yes, so you can have different providers through different sources. The way that would look in Studio, though, you would have like OneRoster SAS for Aries here, then you'd have another Aries, probably flat file, right, where I'm pulling out supplemental data via a file. So if it's not governed by that API, I can supplement that with a second integration through file pulls. And we had another question here on Synergy. I think I answered that. So the question here was, what's the best way to pull data from Synergy? And I believe EduPoint Synergy is a flat file based approach. I could be wrong, but the last time that we talked to them, it was a flat file pull. So they, to my knowledge, don't have an API, but those things change. A lot of these vendors are very quick to accommodate these use cases, and everyone recognizes that API is the best way to do it. It's faster, it's simpler, especially if you're using as much as possible an open standard like OneRoster. And that's the other point too. There was a clarification here. Synergy does have option to license their OneRoster API. And I want to be also clear too, some of these vendors may charge you. Like I know McGraw-Hill has some charges if you want to do like SAML Federation. So I don't want to position us as an expert on each of these vendors. That's why we don't charge them for anything. We have an open support relationship with them, but we're not very in tune with their business models. But I do know just from experience that some of them do charge like, you want access to our OneRoster, that's going to be an additional subscription fee, which we don't have any control over or any ability to mitigate. And I see here Patrick acknowledged that Synergy does have the option to license their OneRoster API, which is great. So if they do have an API support, then obviously we'll be able to pull data that way as well. The second question here was, do Synergy the same way we do Synergy for Clever, same flat files? Yeah, so if you're providing flat files to Clever, and again, I don't want to position this as, well, if you're using this, you shouldn't be using Clever. There should be no conflict, right? So if Clever is solving a bunch of problems for you, the recommended approach is if it's not broke, don't try and fix it. But I will tell you that as this product matures and we get more granular analytics available, my opinion might change, right? Because then it might be beneficial to the school district to centralize these processes so you have, good auditability of your data. When you start having multiple services and no clear view of that data, you start to get kind of a muddled picture. But today I would say that this can work with Clever and it doesn't displace it. Unless you just hate Clever. The other question here is it safe to assume that if Studio has been used to roster files into another vendor, that there will be an SSO tile added to applications? The answer to that is no, not yet. So this was kind of built to be standalone. It is accessible from our solution portal here, as you can see. But it will be a one-stop shop for all your configurations. So today, you will configure SSO in applications by adding an application in your catalog, and then you would do rostering in your Studio. But as this matures over the coming year, that will change, and it will be a single point to configure for both SSO and rostering. So what I would recommend is if you want to start leveraging this today, again, there's no charge for it, for the software. I would recommend you reach out to either your customer success manager or your account executive, and they can get this license for you. And so you guys can start testing it and leveraging it. And we're definitely in feedback mode right now. We want this to be one of the more community-owned components of our solution. We recognize that the best way to do that is going to be communication. So we'll be providing some user group options for us in the coming weeks to months so that we can have open communication on the product and get your feedback on how to make it a better experience for all of you. With that, I want to thank everybody for their time today. I'm going to go ahead and stop. And Rachel, will turn it back over to you.
Thanks again for joining us, and we hope everybody has a great day.